Hello, I'm representing Jane Rowley Connelly, and I want to tell you a little bit about my life here in this beautiful part of the world. I'll start with where I was born to give you a little background first. I was born in 1848 in the part of England near Bath, England, and Cardiff, Wales. And my father, William, had been previously married to a lady named Ann Taylor, and they had 8 children. And then Ann Taylor died, and he married my mother, Ann Jewell, and she had 7 children with my father, and I was number 7. So I was number 15 out of 15 children. What happened was, in me being born in 48, but before that, in the early 40s, some preachers came to that part of England representing what was called the Mormon Church. And my parents both decided they wanted to become members. Well, they were prosperous at the time they joined the church, but shortly thereafter, they had 2 very severe crop failures, and as farmers, they ended up, due to the crop failures and also some very unhappy neighbors that were not supportive of them becoming part of this religious group, they ended up having to sell all of their land, their house, and almost every belonging they had to pay their debts. This was so distressing to my father, William, that he died prematurely about 7 months before I was actually born. Well, during the next 7 years, our mother, Ann, and then we had Eliza with us. She was the youngest child that father had from his first marriage to Ann Taylor. Eliza was with us, then my 2 older sisters, Louisa and Elizabeth, then my 4 older brothers and I. We worked and helped our mother as best we could save money. She was determined that she wanted to immigrate to Utah with the saints that were moving out into the desert. It wasn't, of course, known as Utah in those days, but to the western edges of the continent. So we saved, and with the aid of the Perpetual Immigration Fund, which was lending money to the saints so they could travel west, we were able to leave in 1856. One of the problems with the beginning of our journey in 1856 was there was a lot of demands for shipping out of the port in Liverpool, and so we were late starting that year with Captain Willie in charge of our company. Then we finally made it across the ocean, and a harrowing train ride, I don't have time to tell you about, across part of the United States until we got to the far edge of Iowa. And then we made it to Florence, Nebraska, and we wanted to set out right away as soon as possible to finish the last part of our journey to the Great Salt Lake Valley. But there was a shortage of handcarts. In fact, there were none to be had at that time, and we were not wealthy enough to afford an expensive wagon and an oxen team. We had to go by handcart. We had to wait while they hastily, with green, undried wood, put together handcarts as quickly as possible. And then we, after quite a bit of debate and discussion, most of us decided we were going to hurry on and try to beat the winter storms. We started out, and the handcarts, because of their craftsmanship, in a big hurry, started failing. Axles were breaking, problems like that slowed us down even more. And we still continued toward the valley, Salt Lake Valley. Our mother encouraged us to scavenge along this trail for bits of shoe leather and old harness that was left behind. And we would, when we find these little scraps, we would toast them over a fire and then chew on them like a snack. Or we would put them in a kettle of hot water and boil them till they were soft. And then we would just chew on them, pretending that we had food, sometimes when we were a little hungry. Well, on one of these days when my brother Tommy and I was only 8 and he was 10, we were picking along the side of the trail looking for goodies. And also another thing that we did eat was buffalo meat that was provided by hunters in our group that we would dry and jerk, and we would chew on that. Well, we were looking for goodies along the trail, and we got separated from the main company, And before we knew it, they had crossed a section of the winding river, and we were on the wrong side of the river, and we could not figure out, the two of us, how to get across. So we got a little nervous. We found a little spot, somewhat sheltered, and sat down and waited to get rescued. Well, it didn't take long for Mother to figure out we were missing, and they sent back a rescue party. And our older brother, John, who was 16, was not happy at all. We got a big scolding when we were rescued, and after that, we stayed much closer to Mother. As time went on, some of the animals pulling what wagons we did have as support for the handcarts began to fail and die, necessitating removing some of the supplies from the wagons that we couldn't take anymore and putting that weight into the handcarts. Well, when the extra weight came into the handcarts, we had to take out clothing and bedding and things like that and leave that along the trail because we couldn't carry everything, and we tried to carry the basic food provisions. We continued westward, but unfortunately, when we were on the plains of Wyoming, there was a violent blizzard that came that fall of '56, starting about October 18 or 19. Was so ferocious, the wind factor and the cold snow, we were fighting every minute of the day and night to try to move forward or to camp and to stay warm. This went on for a couple of days as we grew weaker and weaker. And my older brother, Johnny, that I mentioned was 16, because he was the oldest boy in the family, a lot of the heavy labor and responsibility fell on his shoulders. He became so weary that one night we were still not quite to camp. He lay down on the trail and he couldn't go any further. So Captain Willie came up and tried to coax him to get up and move. He threatened him. He said, "You can't lie there, you won't live." Johnny couldn't get up, and we had to watch, Mother and I, as Captain Willie had to whip him. To get him on his feet. Well, 2 days later, he fell completely and lay there on the side of the trail. Behind the handcarts in our little group, there was what they called the hospital wagon or the sick wagon. They picked him up along the side of the trail, but by then 2 parts of his body had frozen. But they made it into camp with the people in the wagon that were ill. And between that night and the next morning, 15 people died of exposure. Well, luckily for us, before the storms hit, back in September, there were a group of missionaries returning from the east to the valley who saw where we were on the trail and were very alarmed at our progress, or lack of progress, really. So they hurried on to the valley and told Brigham Young that we were lagging far behind. And he organized rescue wagons to come towards us, to go east towards us and try to meet us on the trail. So we were in the Willie Handcar Company. There was also the Martin Handcar Company, separate from us, but not too far behind, although at times maybe even 100 miles distant. There was the Hunt Wagon Company that was asked to stay in the rear as a support source. So this rescue wagon started out from Salt Lake, and I've been told over the years that as many as 250 wagons were sent through the snow and the wind from the Salt Lake Valley to try to rescue us up in Wyoming. And fortunately they did. By the time they reached our little encampment in Wyoming, we had been there for 3 days. The last 2 of those days with no food whatsoever. But we were rescued, and we were very grateful, and it was a miracle that my mother made it to the valley with all 7 of us children alive. Well, once we were in Salt Lake Valley, after a certain point of time, a fellow offered to marry my mother and to pay the rest of her immigration fund debt. And so she agreed, and we moved down to Nephi, Utah, further south from the Salt Lake Valley. And I was a teenager then, and after a certain point in time in Nephi, about the age of 16, I met this charming fellow by the name of Charles Connelly, who had a very nice Southern accent and extremely gracious manners, the kind of man that would stand up when a woman walked in the room and stand up when she left the room and pull out the chair and push in the chair when she wanted to sit at the table. He had a lot of social graces. And he was actually 16 years older than me at 32, but we decided to marry, and we did, and we spent really the next 30 years, the first 30 years of our married life, in this beautiful place we call Dixie. It's called Dixie because Brigham Young asked us, certain families, to come down to this part of the state and try to grow cotton because of the hot, dry climate. And he was always trying to find ways to create industry in this part of the land. And so people came down in the 1850s and 60s to try to do this. And some of them were from the South, so we got nicknamed Dixie. We survived in the early days, during that period, when from the age of 16 to age 40, during that 24 years, I had 12 children. I had 6 girls and 6 boys. And as was not unusual in those days, 3 of my boys did not make it past the age of 12. One died as a young infant, and one was 2 or 3 years old, and my oldest died just before 12. But I was blessed to have 9 children grow to maturity. So Charles had talent for being a school teacher, so in the winters, when the children were all free and not farming with their families, he would teach school. We had one cozy winter up in New Harmony when he taught school. We lived in Harrisburg during that period of time, and we were one of the first few families that started settling in what is now known as the city of Leeds. Charles was very ambitious, and he promoted the idea among our neighbors to petition for a post office so that we could order things through the mail and communicate easier. So he was the first postmaster in Leeds. We managed to build a home there with a lovely orchard. He was also a talented gardener, and he won prizes, local prizes, for his sweet melons. And the children, as a reward for their gardening efforts, were allowed to eat 1 apple a day from the orchard and as much melon as they could hold. It was a happy time together, and we went along doing just fine, having babies almost every other year. And I spent a lot of time with the cotton because that was the main crop we were trying to grow, and got pretty fast at picking cotton, and the kids were helpful doing that, which is one reason I have on my boots and my hat. I wore those today because they're a reminder of all the labor we did outdoors in this part of the world, and also we were able to go where the sheep were penned and grazing out in the landscape. They would get their wool snagged on the bushes, so we would go and pull this long strands of woolly fleece off the bushes, and if we spent enough time, we could gather in one day enough handful of wool that we could card it and then spin it into yarn and crochet. I could crochet socks at night after the children were in bed. That's why I wore my shawl, because of my love of crocheting. And Charles built us a house, and an addition on the house in Leeds, I even had glass windows. So I crocheted some lacy white curtains to go in those windows. Oh, and I forgot to tell you why I'm having the gloves too, because this is to remind me of being an 8-year-old girl in Wyoming as we were crossing the plains, how cold I was and how grateful I am for all the protection that I have, and how much I love gloves. So my hat, my shawl, my boots, and my gloves. Oh, and I'm wearing my best white blouse, which as a woman raising children in the 1860s and 70s and 80s down here with a lot of wind and dust, I very seldom put on a white blouse, but this is a special occasion to tell my story. What else do I want to tell you? Let's see. Lots of spinning cotton and yarn, making wool. We would actually then weave fabric, so we were making a lot of our clothes in those early days. And we loved living down here. Another thing, there was a certain point in the 80s when Silver Reef started to lose its economic viability as a mine. And not too long after that, I want to say it was 1896, we decided to go down to the Muddy River with the children we still had living at home and homestead down there. And we were there just a few years, and then Charles got the idea of trying out chloride Arizona with some mining. Unfortunately, he ended up dying there. He was, again, I said 16 years older than me. He died when we were in Arizona, and I eventually moved to Los Angeles, California, where I lived until 1930 when I was about 82 years old and enjoyed a peaceful, happy end to my life. So I just want to say I'm very grateful for the time that I lived in this part of the country and the wonderful people down here that I was blessed to know.